Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Thoughts in History from a Centenarian with Dale Dyer. I want to start out by apologizing for the long time span it's been yet again since I posted the last episode to YouTube. I really have been trying to get back up to Pops to film more footage for the series. It just hasn't worked out for a while until last Saturday, and I only got enough footage for 2 episodes filmed before I had to leave to come back home. However, on a side note, he did have me busy doing odd jobs around his house in preparation for the holidays for over half the time I was there, so I didn't get nearly the amount of footage I was hoping to get. So hopefully after the holidays I'll be able to get back up to Blue Ridge for more interview footage, but don't expect too much before then. So with that being said, in this episode we'll be backing up a little to Dale's flight instructor days at the Smyrna Army Air Base and how he met Virginia, the love of his life and future wife-to-be. Their first dates, how he met her parents and their first impressions of him. And to top off the episode, he's got more war stories to tell of his time before and after being overseas during the war. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome back to another episode of Thoughts in History from a Centenarian with Dale Dyer. On this episode, we will be kind of backing up on some of the stories that Dale told us in the beginning, as some of the earlier episodes. And by the way, before I go any further, I want to apologize for it being so long since our last episode was published on YouTube. I've been trying to get up here and get some footage, get some content to edit and publish, but just hasn't worked out. And finally got up here today, which is a week right before Christmas. Or actually less than a week, because Christmas is going to fall on Friday of next week. So we are Saturday the week before. So anyway, I apologize for not getting up here and getting some footage sooner, but we're going to try to get quite a bit today and be able to get it published and all. So with that, I want to move on into what we were talking about. In one of the earlier episodes, we had talked and discussed Dale's time in Nashville as a flight instructor on the B-24s. And after reviewing that footage and while editing it, I realized that we had not talked about how he had met Virginia, my mother and his wife, during that time. And so we're going to back up and talk more about his personal life, about what happened during that time, not only with him flight instructing and still somewhat learning himself and everything, but also his personal life, which of course obviously had a long-term effect on the future of us all. So with that, we'll move on in. Pot, I know I've heard the story many times over the years, how you met Mom and everything, but let's hear it in your own words. How did you meet Mom? Why was Mom in Nashville in the first place? Who was she there with? Why was she at a dance there at the Air Force Base where you were stationed at?
Okay, I just say that since our last episode, I've gained another year celebration, so it's now past 100 years. But I'd like to kind of review some of the things that took place when we first met, and this was while I was instructing at Smyrna, Tennessee, in the B-24. Been kept there as an instructor for almost a year, and Mom had left Blue Ridge here, finished high school, and had gone up to Nashville and lived with her Aunt Hattie Love, who was her husband, worked for the L&N Railroad, and they had moved from over here in Etowah, Tennessee, up to Nashville during the war. So she went up there and was going to a business school, drone business school, down in the center of Nashville. And she'd met a girl that also was from Nashville, and they become good friends, and they decided to come out to the Air Base at a USO dance. That was often the case at air bases and different training bases. The local girls would come out to dances that they would have, and they'd get to meet one another. Well, I spotted her shortly after they come in. She and Gladys, her girlfriend, and I asked her for a dance, and so we danced a little while, and we needed to kind of cool off, so we went outside, and it was a water tower right beside there in Smyrna, Tennessee, which is a very small little town, less than probably 300 population.
Was this tower on the base, or was it?
Just adjoined the base.
Joined the base.
It was right there at the base, just about.
So it was off the base, but it was in the town of Smyrna.
That's right.
Okay.
And so we got further acquainted, and I was going to have a day off in about 3 days, and I asked her for a date at that time because we were on a schedule of flying 6 hours and then being off for 12 hours and flying again 6 hours and off 12 hours, and this did that for 3 days running, and then we was off for 47 hours to rest up. So I picked her up and we went out to dinner to one of the hotels in Nashville, and we just got better acquainted, and she kind of become a special date for me, and we dated several times, and then she finished drone school, and she came back to Blue Ridge to work for her dad in one of his hardware stores. And about that time, I was going through training with students every day on that schedule. So she had a birthday, and she invited me to come down to her birthday party, which was on February the 12th, while I was still up there at Nashville, and she was down here in Blue Ridge. So I had my 4 students up that afternoon, and I made my way down here, came to Chattanooga and then to Copper Hill, and then flew down to Blue Ridge. Now, I didn't know where she lived here, Blue Ridge, so I made a slow swooping pass over Blue Ridge, dived down and picked up a lot of speed, and then come across Blue Ridge and then pulled up full power. And later on, her future mother-in-law, she claimed that I tried to take a chimney off her house. Well, I wasn't that low. It probably sounded that way, but it evidently woke up the town. They'd never had anybody do something like that before.
I'm sure so, because B-24 with four engines making a low pass over a small town, I would say that would be pretty loud.
Well, I had brought down Gladys and her sister down here with me to help celebrate the Mom's birthday, my wife-to-be, and it was a cold weekend. When we came into Blue Ridge that night, we'd just had a snowstorm, and a real cold front went through, and that night it was 4 below when we got into Blue Ridge.
And
it was on Saturday night, and I went to church with them on Sunday morning again.
You was driving a convertible, weren't you?
Yeah.
And that thing was getting froze up because the top didn't fit too well on it, right?
I guess so.
But you came in the old Scenic Drive road. That was the main road between Blue Ridge and McKaysville, Copper Hill back then, wasn't it?
That's right.
And it was gravel. It wasn't even paved at that time, wasn't it?
No.
Yeah.
And it was quite a time, and an eye-opener to me, because I'd never been in this section of the country before. And to come to Chattanooga and come through Copper Hill and all those barren red hills, that was really some sight back at that time. Sure. No vegetation at all. 50 square miles of barren land around Ducktown and Copper Hill at that time.
Yeah.
The Tennessee Copper Company had turned loose sulfuric acid into the air and killed all the vegetation. Well, even before then, they used all the wood that they could, all the trees they could cut for miles around to put into to use at the plant to smelt the ore to right. Divide it, to separate it from the copper and the gold and the silver and all the different
minerals,
things that they had to do. This was a very barren country. Blue Ridge had trees, but we also had a lot of damage. And when the wind was in the right direction, that acid would be in the air and kill the vegetable gardens and a lot of trees. And the company had to pay the damage to a lot of folks, even down as far as LJ. It was reported to us that.
So whenever you was flying in from Nashville and you were coming into Blue Ridge, basically all you had to do, you could do it by dead reckoning and looking for a big old red spot in eastern Tennessee, go to it, and then fly south from it down to Blue Ridge, right?
Yes. We were here Saturday and Sunday and got to kind of get acquainted with Mom's friends around here, and they took me. We drove over on 64 highway down the river road, and there was a bridge down there that's off to the right of the 4-lane that exists there now, and I think that bridge might be still across the large stream before you hit the main twisting and turning down the river road, as we call it. Then on our way back to Nashville, with these two girls with me, we went up on top of Lookout Mountain over at Chattanooga and drove around Chattanooga and got a little acquainted with that. But it was cold and it was still slippery from the snow and the cold weather. We slid around a little bit on that trip up on Lookout Mountain.
Because it's quite a bit higher up there than all that surrounding area. Obviously, as anyone who's ever been over to Chattanooga and around Lookout Mountain is quite a bit higher than Chattanooga, so it gets on up there, and it's much cooler up there than it is down in the valley and all, isn't it? You came down for Mom's birthday, is that right? And met the family. So how did that go?
It went great. We pretty much decided to make a future out of it. So my father-in-law and mother-in-law, they evidently accepted me, and they were kind of particular about who Jen dated and everything. After I got back to Smyrna and had been there for almost a year, I was up flying a major, I think it was, that day, because all the Air Force personnel, to get flying pay, had to get in 4 hours a month to flying time in order to qualify to get flying pay. Well, most of those fellows had less than 50 hours of actual flying and wasn't really proficient at it in the planes, but they wanted to get that flying time, so they'd assign some of those fellows to me to take them up and fly them around for 3 or 4 hours to get their time in. Well, we were up one day with this major, and all at once the engineer, we had every airplane that flew of the 4-engine, they'd have to have an engineer that's supposed to know everything about that airplane, and he was his airplane, and he was assigned to keep that airplane repaired or whatever was needed for it. And so they did a lot of flying, the engineers did. Anyway, we were up flying, and all at once he come up to me, and I began to smell gas, and he says one of the caps on the wing gas tanks had come off, and it was sucking gas out over the back of the wing, and he was hoping it wouldn't catch fire. If it did, the plane would blow up. So I immediately called the base and told them we had an emergency, we needed to land immediately. And so they prepared for us landing, and they had all the fire department out and waiting on us, and we were lucky enough to come in and land without the plane exploding.
Now, did you land back in Smyrna?
Back at Smyrna. We landed at Smyrna. And a month or so later, I'd been there for quite a while. All at once, I was up as a student and got a phone call to land immediately that afternoon, and I did. they says I was scheduled to leave that night at 10:30 from Chattanooga on a special mission assignment, and there was 5 of us, we instructors, that was on this special order, and we had to dispose of everything we had. I had a '39 Buick convertible that I'd acquired, and I had to dispose of it. What I could put in a duffel bag is all I could carry with me, and I had to send everything else home in a foot locker and so forth. Anyway, that night flew out of Nashville at 10:30, and we arrived the next morning out in Los Angeles after about 4 or 5 stops between here and there, and called up some of my relatives in Los Angeles, and we were having to wait for 2 or 3 hours before we flew on up to Fresno, California, where we were being assigned, and that's what our orders said. Well, I got to meet my cousins out there and so forth for a little bit. Well, from Los Angeles up to Fresno on the flight, a lady sat beside me that had never flown before, and she was scared to death.
Now, was this commercial flying that you done?
This was commercial.
Okay.
Yeah, on a commercial plane.
Now, and back then, it was still prop jobs too, wasn't it?
Yes, definitely all prop jobs.
Yeah.
There was no jets back then.
Yeah.
At that time. Anyway, she held on to my arm, and she left fingerprints there. She hanging on to me so tight. So it was quite interesting. Well, we got there at Fresno, and we kept waiting for our next order, and they seemed to have lost our orders, and they couldn't tell what we were there for, and we were there about 10 days, and they finally sent it out from Washington, D.C. to try to find out about us, and they found out that we were supposed to have been sent to San Francisco instead of Fresno. They'd made out the wrong orders for us. Well, we went back to Lincoln, Nebraska to wait till another month or so before we could get into the next phase of our training. Well, this was kind of a very strange situation, and we didn't know what had happened. Well, about 9 months later, after we had gone through our next phase of training at Boise, Idaho, and we'd finished there with a new crew and was getting ready to go overseas, I ended up at the Air Base at Denver and was catching a flight out of there on a plane that was from Smyrna back to Tulsa, Oklahoma, because we had about a week leave time before we were scheduled to go overseas. Well, anyway, I run into this fella by accident. He walked into the room where I was waiting for this plane.
Now, was this commercial?
This was Army.
Army.
Yeah, and anyway, it was Lieutenant Lawrence, who had been an instructor like I was down at Smyrna, and he had all these ribbons on him. And I said, "What on earth? Where'd those ribbons? How'd you get all those ribbons?" He says, "I went where you were supposed to have gone." He says, "When you left and they lost you, they picked 5 more of us instructors and sent us to San Francisco. And since we were sent to the South Pacific, we flew 6 missions in the South Pacific on a B-24. Then they sent us to England, and we flew another 6 missions in England. And then they sent us back to the States, and we've had a month's leave here, and I'm scheduled to go to Alamogordo, New Mexico to fly the new B-29. He says, "This is where you were supposed to have gone." Well, later on, at the end of the war, and I ended up down at Alamogordo, I talked to some of the instructors down there and asked them if they remembered Lieutenant Lawrence, who'd come through there and trained on the B-29s, which was the biggest airplane during the war. And they says, yes, he went to the South Pacific and he was shot down on his 3rd mission. They never heard from him again.
Now, this was his second time over the South Pacific. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, but he was in a 29 the second time. He was in a 24 the first time he was there. So, so many things for that nature took place. We just couldn't fathom how all these things happened like they did.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just a strange situation. That war thing periods that there's a big mixture of people that went places and met people that they never would have met if it hadn't been for the war. Even though we had a lot of folks that lost their lives because the World War II. I didn't realize it till I read and heard from being in World War II, and so almost all the nations of the world were involved in it, and there was 78 million people lost their lives in World War II for statistics that they put together, and of that 78 million, the civilian population, not the fighting part of the war, but 70% of the fatalities were civilians because of all the bombing and the destruction that was waged in cities and so forth. Civilians are so defenseless, such things as the type of war that took place in World War II. So that period of people experienced something that had never been even hardly thought of in severity as what this war was. But anyway.
Well, the type of war back then, they unfortunately used carpet bombing on both sides, not just the Allied side, but the Axis side as well. And so there was a lot of civilians that was killed back then, unfortunately. But nowadays we have much more precision type missiles and stuff like that. War, though, is still bad, no matter when or how it's fought. But with that being said, I think we're pretty much out of time for this segment, for this episode. So let's bring this to a close, and we'll pick up from there in our next episode. Just want to thank everybody for joining us and watching this, and be looking for our next episode. Thanks so much. Thanks for watching, everyone, and if you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like below and consider supporting our channel by clicking on the subscribe button as well. If you have any questions or suggestions for content, please leave a comment below and we will be sure to read them. And to be notified of any new uploads, turn on notifications at the upper right hand corner of your screen, and we will see you in our next episode.